The morning started like any other in Oak Ridge, a town so small and unassuming that it barely appeared on maps. Claire Harper, an 18-year-old girl with a quick wit and an indomitable spirit, had spent most of her life dreaming of escape. Not that she disliked her home. She loved the sprawling fields, the animals, and the sense of peace that came with farm life. But she also yearned for the wider world, one where she could shed the label of farmer's daughter and make a name for herself. Her father, John Harper, stood beside her, his calloused hands loading feed bags into the back of their weathered old truck. His face, lined with years of labor under the sun, was calm and steady as always. Claire often wondered what kept him so grounded, so unshakable. It was as if nothing in this world could rattle him. But she knew there was more to her father than met the eye. A history he never spoke of, scars he kept hidden beneath his strong exterior. The day was already hot, the sun high and blazing as they pulled into the rundown gas station on the edge of town. Claire jumped out of the truck, wiping sweat from her brow as she grabbed the first bag of feed. She glanced toward the horizon, where the road disappeared into a blur of heat waves. A faint rumble caught her attention, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. "What's that?" she asked, tilting her head to listen. John didn't look up. "Probably just a couple of trucks. Let's finish up and get home." But Claire wasn't so sure. The sound wasn't the steady hum of diesel engines. It was deeper, rawer, like thunder rolling across the plains. Her heart skipped a beat as a line of motorcycles appeared in the distance, kicking up a plume of dust as they roared toward the gas station. The first bike pulled into the parking lot, followed by 4 others, each one louder and more menacing than the last. Claire froze, the bag of feed slipping from her grasp and landing on the ground with a dull thud. She recognized the insignia on their jackets, the Iron Wolves. She had heard stories about them from towns farther up the highway. They were a gang known for their chaos, intimidation, and complete disregard for the law. Oak Ridge was the kind of place they rarely visited, too quiet, too far off the beaten path. But today, for reasons Claire couldn't fathom, they had chosen her town. The bikers dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel as they spread out. Their leader, a tall man with a chiseled face and tattoos creeping up his neck, removed his sunglasses and surveyed the gas station with a predatory smirk. His piercing eyes locked onto Claire. "Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "A little country girl out on her daddy's farm. Ain't that just precious?" Claire's stomach churned. She glanced at her father, who was still at the pump, his back to the bikers. For a moment, she thought about calling out to him, but something stopped her. John had always taught her to stand her ground, to never show fear. She squared her shoulders and ignored the man's taunts, turning back to the truck to grab another bag of feed. But the gang wasn't going to let her off that easy. The leader, she would later learn his name was Jake Fury Daniels, took a step closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "Hey, sweetheart, don't be rude now. We're just trying to be friendly." The other bikers laughed, their voices grating and cruel. One of them, a hulking man with a patch over his eye, picked up a dirty rag from a nearby counter and tossed it at Claire. "Here, darling, why don't you wipe down our bikes? Might keep you busy while the men talk." The rag hit the ground at her feet, and Claire's hands balled into fists. Her cheeks burned with anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not interested," she said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her throat. Fury laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Not interested? Oh, sweetheart, you haven't even heard what we're offering." One of the bikers stepped forward, brushing against Claire as he passed. His breath reeked of tobacco and beer as he leaned close to her ear. "You sure about that? You look like you could use some excitement in your life." Before Claire could respond, her father turned around. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in the bikers, their smirks, and the way they loomed over his daughter. For a moment, he didn't say anything, but Claire could see the tension in his jaw. the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Leave her alone," John said, his voice low and calm. Fury raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And who's gonna make us, old man?" "You?" John didn't flinch. He took a step closer, placing himself between Claire and the bikers. "You don't want to do this," he said, his tone steady and authoritative. The gang erupted into laughter. Fury stepped forward until he was face to face with John, towering over him. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he sneered. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Claire watched, her heart pounding, as her father stood his ground. There was something different about him now, something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't fearlessness, it was certainty. As if he knew exactly what he was doing, as if he had faced worse than this, and come out the other side. "You've had your fun," John said. "Now it's time to move on." Fury's smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "You don't tell me what to do," he said, his voice hardening. John didn't respond. Instead, he locked eyes with Fury, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until one of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Fury stepped back, shaking his head. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said, turning toward his bike. "Come on, boys. Let's get out of this dump." The gang followed him reluctantly, their bravado deflated. Claire watched as they mounted their bikes and roared out of the gas station, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. She turned to her father, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and confusion. "Dad," she began, but he shook his head. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. "We've got work to do." As they climbed into the truck and pulled away from the gas station, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her father than she had ever known, and she had a sinking suspicion that the iron wolves weren't gone for good. The drive back to the farm was silent. Claire stole glances at her father, trying to decipher the expression on his face. It wasn't anger, but something deeper, a quiet storm brewing behind his steady gaze. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a firmness that seemed unnatural for a simple ride home. Claire's thoughts churned. She had never seen her father like this. Sure, he was protective, but the way he stood up to the bikers wasn't just about shielding her. It was calculated, as if he'd assessed every possible outcome before making his move. She wanted to ask him about it, but the words caught in her throat. As they pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of their modest farmhouse and sprawling fields should have brought her comfort. Instead, Claire felt an unease that refused to let go. She hopped out of the truck, brushing off the dust from her jeans, and followed her father toward the barn. "Dad," she finally said, her voice tentative, "what happened back there? I've never seen you like that." John paused mid-step, turning to face her. For a moment, he looked as if he might explain, but then he shook his head. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "Let's just focus on finishing the chores." "But those guys," Claire started, only to be cut off by the sharp look in his eyes. "Claire," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Drop it." She bit her lip, frustration bubbling inside her. He always did this, kept his walls up, never letting her see the man beneath. It was infuriating. But Claire also knew better than to push him when he was like this. Instead, she nodded and went to work, unloading the feed bags and tending to the animals. The hours passed, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. By the time they finished, Claire's arms ached, and her shirt was soaked with sweat. She leaned against the barn door, watching her father as he secured the last of the supplies. Despite his age, John moved with a precision and strength that belied the years of hard labor he'd endured. As they walked back to the house, Claire decided she couldn't let it go. "They're not gone," she said, breaking the silence. John didn't respond. "You know they're coming back," she pressed. "Guys like that don't just let things go." John stopped walking and turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weight to his gaze that made her stomach flip. "If they come back," he said slowly, "we'll handle it." "We?" Claire asked, her voice rising. "Dad, there were 5 of them. And what about next time? What if they bring more?" "I said we'll handle it," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Claire threw up her hands in exasperation. "You can't just brush this off like it's nothing. You're not some kind of superhero, Dad. What are you going to do if they—" "I've dealt with worse," he said, cutting her off. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Claire stared at him, her mind racing. What did he mean by that? She had always known her father had a past he didn't talk about, but this was different. This wasn't the quiet stoicism she was used to. This was a man who spoke from experience she couldn't begin to fathom. "Let it go, Claire," he said, his voice softening. "Please." Reluctantly, she nodded and followed him inside. But her mind refused to rest. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed the events at the gas station over and over again. The way her father had stood his ground. The way the bikers had backed down despite their numbers. It didn't make sense. The Iron Wolves plot their return. Meanwhile, miles away, the Iron Wolves gathered at a dilapidated bar on the outskirts of town. The dimly lit room reeked of stale beer and smoke, the air thick with tension as Fury slammed his fist onto the table. "That old man," he growled, his voice seething with anger. "Who the hell does he think he is?" The gang exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen Fury this rattled. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, on intimidation. But something about John Harper had shaken him. "Maybe we just let it go," one of the bikers muttered. "The guy's a nobody. A farmer." Fury's glare silenced him. "Nobody makes a fool out of me," he spat. "Especially not some washed-up hillbilly." Viper, the biker with the eye patch, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "So what's the plan, boss?" "We go back, teach him a lesson." Fury nodded, his jaw tight. "Tomorrow, we'll pay him a little visit. But this time, we do it my way." The gang erupted in laughter, their confidence restored. They were the Iron Wolves. After all, nobody crossed them and got away with it. The storm brewing. The next morning, Claire woke to the sound of her father chopping wood outside. She dressed quickly and went to find him, her resolve to get answers stronger than ever. As she approached, she noticed something different. John's movements were sharper, more deliberate, as if he were preparing for something. "Dad," she said, stepping closer. "Can we talk?" He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. "About what?" "About whatever it is you're not telling me," she said, crossing her arms. "I know there's more to you than just being a farmer. I saw it yesterday. You weren't scared of them. Not even for a second." John sighed, setting down the axe. For a moment, Claire thought he might brush her off again. But then he looked at her, his eyes heavy with the weight of years. "There are things in my past," he began slowly, "that I haven't told you. Not because I don't trust you, but because I wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Claire asked, her voice soft. "From the kind of man I used to be," he said, "before your mother, before this farm. I've done things, Claire. Things I'm not proud of. But I don't regret them, because they kept people I cared about safe." Claire's breath caught. "You mean, you've fought before?" John nodded, "More times than I care to remember. But that life is behind me now. Or at least it was." The unspoken words hung between them. Claire knew what he meant. The Iron Wolves weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat. And her father, for all his quiet strength, was preparing to face them head-on. "What if they come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will," John said, his tone resolute. "And when they do, I'll be ready." Claire's heart pounded. For the first time, she saw her father not just as the man who had raised her, but as someone with a past far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And as much as it terrified her, she also felt a spark of something else. Pride. Whatever was coming, she knew one thing for certain. Her father wasn't going to back down, and neither would she. The quiet of Oak Ridge wouldn't last much longer. The day began with an eerie calm that set Claire on edge. The air felt heavier, the sun's heat more oppressive. She tried to focus on her chores, feeding the chickens, cleaning out the barn, but her mind kept drifting to the bikers and her father's cryptic words. She had always known he was strong, resilient, but now she understood there was more to him than she had ever guessed. John, meanwhile, was preparing in his own way. He spent the morning reinforcing the locks on the doors and windows, checking the perimeter of their property. Claire watched him from the kitchen window, her stomach twisting with worry. He moved with purpose, his actions precise and deliberate, like a man who had done this 100 times before. The day began with an eerie calm that set Claire on edge. The air felt heavier, the sun's heat more oppressive. She tried to focus on her chores, feeding the chickens, cleaning out the barn, but her mind kept drifting to the bikers and her father's cryptic words. She had always known he was strong, resilient, but now she understood there was more to him than she had ever guessed. John, meanwhile, was preparing in his own way. He spent the morning reinforcing the locks on the doors and windows, checking the perimeter of their property. Claire watched him from the kitchen window, her stomach twisting with worry. He moved with purpose, his actions precise and deliberate, like a man who had done this 100 times before. After lunch, Claire decided she couldn't stand the silence any longer. She found her father in the barn, sorting through a box of tools that looked far too advanced for anything they'd ever needed on the farm. He barely acknowledged her presence as she approached. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "what's all this?" He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Precautions." "For what?" she pressed. "You think they're really coming back?" John paused, setting down the wrench he was holding. "I don't think, Claire, I know." His certainty sent a chill down her spine. "And what are you going to do if they do?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Fight them off with a hammer." Her attempt at humor fell flat. John straightened, meeting her gaze with a seriousness that made her heart race. "If they come back," he said, "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The weight of his words hung in the air. Claire wanted to argue, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but deep down, she knew he was right. The Iron Wolves weren't the kind of people to let things go. And her father wasn't the kind of man to run. The Iron Wolves' return. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the afternoon quiet like a thunderclap. Claire froze mid-step, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder, closer. She ran to the window and saw the bikers tearing down the gravel driveway, their tires kicking up clouds of dust. They came to a stop in front of the house, their engines idling like growling beasts. John stepped out onto the porch, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. He didn't speak as the bikers dismounted, spreading out in a semicircle. Fury was at the center, his smirk more menacing than before. Well, Fury drawled, taking off his sunglasses. "Didn't think we'd be seeing you again so soon, old man." John crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. "You weren't invited." The gang laughed, their voices harsh and mocking. Fury took a step forward, his gaze flicking to the house and then back to John. "You got some nerve, talking to us like that," he said. "But I get it. You're trying to act tough for your little girl." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She was watching from the kitchen, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to run out there, to stand by her father, but fear rooted her in place. "I told you to leave her alone," John said, his voice steady. "And I told you I don't take orders from anyone." Fury shot back. He gestured to the bikers behind him. "We're here to teach you a lesson. Show you what happens when you mess with the Iron Wolves." John didn't move. "You've got 5 seconds to leave." The gang erupted into laughter again. But Claire noticed something, an unease creeping into their expressions. Fury's bravado faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Or what?" he sneered. "You think you can take all of us by yourself?" John's gaze didn't waver. 5, Fury's smirk faded. 4. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. 3. Fury's hand twitched toward his belt, where a knife gleamed in its sheath. 2. Before Fury could react, John moved. One moment he was standing still, the next he was a blur of motion. In a single fluid movement, he grabbed the wrench he tucked into his waistband and swung it upward, knocking the knife from Fury's hand. The clang of metal hitting the ground was deafening in the sudden silence. Fury stumbled back, clutching his wrist in shock. "Get off my property," John said, his voice low and dangerous. Claire's awakening. From the kitchen, Claire's jaw dropped. She had never seen her father like this. Quick, calculated, completely in control. The bikers hesitated, their confidence visibly shaken. But Fury wasn't ready to back down. "You think that scares us?" he snarled, cradling his injured hand. "We'll make you regret that, old man." "Try me," John said, his grip on the wrench tightening. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the bikers spoke up. "Come on, Fury. Let's go. We'll deal with him later." Fury glared at John, his chest heaving with rage. "This isn't over," he spat. He motioned for his gang to follow, and one by one, they mounted their bikes and roared away. Claire ran outside as soon as they were gone. "Dad!" she exclaimed, her voice a mix of fear and awe. "What just happened? How did you?" John cut her off with a shake of his head. "Not now, Claire. We don't have much time." "What do you mean?" she asked, her heart pounding. "They're gone. They'll be back," he said grimly. "And next time, they'll bring more." The quiet before the storm. As the afternoon wore on, Claire helped her father secure the farm. He showed her how to reinforce the doors and windows, how to set up makeshift barricades. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But John's calm demeanor grounded her, gave her a sense of purpose. "Why are you so calm about this?" she asked as they worked. "Aren't you scared?" He paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Fear is normal," he said, "but letting it control you, that's a choice, and I don't have time to be scared when your safety is on the line." Claire nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Her father was a man who would fight for her, no matter the cost. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in shadows, Claire realized something else. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was angry. Angry at the bikers for their arrogance, at the world for its cruelty, and at herself for underestimating her father. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't sit by and let him face it alone. She was her father's daughter, and she was ready to fight. The next morning, a dense fog hung over the farm, shrouding it in an eerie stillness. Claire woke with a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of the iron wolves and her father's cryptic warning. The image of him standing unflinching in front of the gang, deflecting their threats with an almost supernatural calm, played on a loop in her head. When she stepped out onto the porch, she found John already at work, as if nothing unusual had happened. He was sharpening a blade, the rhythmic sound of metal scraping against stone cutting through the silence. Beside him, a hunting rifle leaned against the railing, its barrel gleaming faintly in the morning light. "You're up early," Claire said, her voice still groggy. "Couldn't sleep," John replied without looking up. His tone was even, but Claire could sense the tension simmering beneath it. She hesitated before sitting down next to him. "Do you really think they'll come back?" John stopped sharpening the blade and set it down carefully. He turned to her, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Yes," he said simply. "And this time, they'll be looking for a fight." Claire's stomach churned. "What are we supposed to do? Call the sheriff?" John let out a bitter chuckle. "The sheriff won't get here in time. And even if he did, those bikers would just disappear before he could do anything." "No, Claire. We can't rely on anyone else. We have to handle this ourselves." The weight of his words settled heavily on her shoulders. Claire had grown up hearing about the importance of resilience and self-reliance, but this was different. This wasn't about fixing a broken fence or surviving a harsh winter. This was about survival, real, life-or-death survival. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "how do you know how to do all this? The way you stood up to them, the way you're preparing now, it's like you've done this before." John's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's a lot about my past that I haven't told you," he said, "not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I didn't want you to carry the weight of it." Claire leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Tell me now. The truth about John Harper." John took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "Before I met your mother, I was a Marine. Served for over a decade. Did tours in some of the worst places you can imagine. Afghanistan, Iraq, places you wouldn't find on a map." Claire's eyes widened. She had always known her father was strong, but she had never imagined he had been a soldier. He rarely talked about his past, and she had assumed it was because there wasn't much to tell. Now she realized how wrong she had been. "I wasn't just a soldier," John continued. "I was part of a unit that handled difficult missions, things most people wouldn't believe. My job was to protect my team, no matter the cost. And I was good at it. Too good." Claire felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened?" John's gaze grew distant, as if he were looking at something far away. "I saw things, Claire. Did things. Things that changed me. By the time I came back home, I wasn't the same person. I met your mother not long after, and she saved me, gave me a reason to leave that life behind." Claire reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said softly. I want to understand." John nodded, his expression softening. "What you need to understand is that I'm not the same man I was back then. But I still remember how to protect the people I care about. And if those bikers come back, I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Preparations for war. As the morning wore on, John and Claire worked together to fortify the farm. John showed her how to set up basic traps along the driveway, sharp spikes concealed under loose gravel, designed to puncture tires. They moved heavy equipment to block the most vulnerable entrances to the house and secured the barn doors with chains and padlocks. John also taught Claire how to handle a hunting rifle. She had used it once before for target practice, but now, every movement felt charged with a new sense of urgency. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to brace herself against the recoil. "You might not need to use it," he said, "but I want you to be ready." Claire nodded, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had always thought of herself as tough. She had grown up on a farm, after all. But this was a different kind of toughness. This was about survival, about facing a threat she had never imagined. By midday, the farm looked more like a fortress. Claire stood in the yard, surveying their work with a mix of pride and trepidation. "Do you really think this will be enough?" she asked. John walked up beside her, his expression unreadable. "It'll have to be. The iron wolves make their move." The sun was just beginning to set when they heard the first rumble of engines. Claire's heart leaped into her throat as she ran to the window. In the distance, she could see the bikers approaching, their headlights cutting through the twilight. This time, there were more of them. At least a dozen motorcycles roared down the driveway, their riders clad in leather and bristling with weapons. Fury was at the front, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and determination. John stepped onto the porch, the hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't move, as the bikers dismounted and spread out in a semicircle around the house. "Well, look who's ready for us," Fury called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the plan, old man? You gonna shoot all of us?" John didn't respond. Instead, he raised the rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of the gun echoed across the fields, momentarily silencing the bikers. "I'm only going to say this once," John said, his voice cold and steady. "Leave now, and no one gets hurt." Fury laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this ain't your little war, soldier boy. This is real life. And in real life, the big dogs win." John's grip on the rifle tightened. "You don't know what you're walking into." Fury's smirk widened. "Oh, I think I do." The calm before the storm. The standoff stretched on, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Claire watched from the window, her hands gripping the rifle her father had given her. She felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of clarity. This was her home, her family, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. John, meanwhile, remained as still as a statue, his eyes locked on Fury. He knew the bikers were trying to intimidate him, to break his resolve, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. "I'll give you one last chance," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Walk away." Fury's expression darkened. "You think you scare me." John didn't respond. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. And then, with a sharp motion, Fury raised his hand, and chaos erupted. The moment Fury raised his hand, chaos exploded like a lightning strike. One of the bikers surged forward, shouting something incomprehensible, but John was faster. He dropped low, his rifle aimed and steady, and fired a shot that hit the ground inches from the man's boots. The crack of the gunshot was deafening, freezing the biker mid-step. "Back up," John bellowed, his voice sharp and commanding. The authority in his tone was enough to make even Fury pause. John stood, his stance unwavering, his rifle pointed at the gang. "Don't do anything stupid," John warned, his eyes sweeping over the group. "This doesn't have to get ugly." But Fury was already signaling to his men. The bikers spread out, circling the house like wolves stalking prey. Claire watched from the window, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Her hands trembled around the rifle her father had given her, but she forced herself to steady her grip. She wouldn't let fear control her. "Dad!" she shouted, but he didn't respond. His focus was locked on Fury, his body taut like a coiled spring. Fury sneered, pulling a switchblade from his belt and flipping it open with a practiced motion. "You think you can scare us off with a few warning shots?" he taunted. "We're the Iron Wolves. We don't back down." John's gaze hardened. "I've dealt with worse than you," he said coldly. "But if you want to test me, go ahead." For a moment, it seemed like Fury might reconsider. The raw determination in John's voice was impossible to ignore. But then he grinned, a cruel, twisted expression that sent a chill down Claire's spine. "Get him," Fury growled. The battle begins. The first biker charge, a crowbar raised high. John moved with a speed that defied his years. He sidestepped the attack, swinging the butt of his rifle into the man's gut. The biker doubled over with a grunt, dropping the crowbar. Before he could recover, John delivered a swift kick that sent him sprawling to the ground. Another biker lunged, this one wielding a chain. John ducked under the swinging metal and countered with a sharp elbow to the man's face, sending him stumbling back. Claire watched in stunned silence. Her father wasn't just holding his own, he was dominating. His movements were precise, efficient, and utterly ruthless. But the bikers weren't giving up. Two more rushed forward, one armed with a baseball bat and the other with a knife. John fired a warning shot into the air, causing the man with the bat to hesitate. Taking advantage of the moment, John swung the rifle in a wide arc, knocking the bat from the man's hands. The one with the knife pressed on, slashing wildly. John stepped back, narrowly avoiding the blade, and then brought the rifle down hard on the biker's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and John followed up with a punch that sent the man reeling. Claire joins the fight. From her vantage point inside the house, Claire realized her father couldn't handle them all alone. Her fear gave way to resolve as she tightened her grip on the rifle. She glanced at the traps they had set earlier, spikes hidden under gravel along the driveway. And an idea formed. She ran to the back door and slipped outside, keeping low to avoid being seen. The biker's attention was focused on her father, giving her the opening she needed. She crept toward the driveway, her heart pounding with every step. When she reached the traps, she crouched down and used a heavy stick to push the gravel aside, exposing the sharp spikes underneath. Then she grabbed a nearby bucket of nails and scattered them across the area, creating a makeshift minefield. As she worked, she could hear the sounds of the fight. The shouts, the grunts, the clang of metal. She glanced toward the house and saw her father holding his ground, his movements as precise as a soldier in battle. But he was outnumbered, and the bikers were closing in. Claire finished her task and hurried back toward the house. She climbed up onto the porch, aiming her rifle at one of the bikers sneaking around the side. "Hey!" she shouted. The man turned just as she pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, hitting the ground near his feet, but it was enough to make him freeze. Claire's voice wavered, but she kept the rifle steady. "Back off." The biker hesitated, his gaze darting between Claire and the others. Finally, he cursed under his breath and retreated toward the driveway, straight into the traps. The moment his motorcycle tires hit the spikes, they burst with a loud pop. The man swore again, stumbling as he tried to avoid stepping on the scattered nails. Claire felt a surge of triumph, but it was short-lived. Fury had seen what she'd done, and his expression darkened. He turned toward her, his knife gleaming in the fading light. "The showdown." "You've got guts, girl," Fury said, stalking toward the porch. "But you're way out of your league." Claire's hands shook as she aimed the rifle at him. "Stay back," she warned. Fury smirked, his pace unrelenting. "What are you gonna do? Shoot me?" "Claire, get inside," John shouted, but she didn't move. Fury was almost at the steps when Claire fired. The shot grazed his shoulder, causing him to stagger. He let out a roar of pain and rage, clutching his arm. "You little..." Before he could finish, John was there. He tackled Fury to the ground, the two men grappling in the dirt. Fury was strong, but John's experience gave him the edge. He twisted Fury's arm, forcing him to drop the knife, and then pinned him with a knee to the chest. "Call them off," John growled, his voice low and dangerous. Fury glared up at him, his face twisted in defiance. "Go to hell." John pressed harder, cutting off Fury's air. "Call them off, or this ends here." For a moment, Claire thought Fury might refuse. But then he raised a hand, signaling to the remaining bikers. "Fall back," he rasped. The gang hesitated, their loyalty to Fury warring with their fear of John. But one by one, they complied, retreating to their motorcycles. Claire watched as they roared away, their engines fading into the distance. The aftermath. John stood, breathing heavily as he watched the bikers disappear. Fury lay in the dirt, coughing and clutching his chest. John turned to Claire, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked. She nodded, her adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Dad, you did good," he said, cutting her off. "But it's not over." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're gone." John's gaze hardened. "Not for long. They'll regroup, and they'll come back with more. We've bought ourselves some time, but we're not safe yet." Claire's stomach dropped. She wanted to believe it was over, that they had won. But looking at her father, she realized the fight was far from finished. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to truly stand her ground. The quiet after the chaos felt unnatural, like the calm before a second, even fiercer storm. Claire sat on the edge of the porch steps, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Her father, John, stood a few feet away, his silhouette stark against the dimming sky. He had Fury's knife in one hand, his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder, and a look of grim determination etched into his features. "Inside," John said, his voice firm but not unkind. Claire hesitated. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the exhaustion in her father's eyes stopped her. Without a word, she stood and walked into the house. She didn't go far, though. Instead, she lingered by the door, peering through the crack to watch her father as he crouched down beside Fury, who was still lying in the dirt. "You made a mistake coming back," John said, his tone as cold as the steel blade he held. Fury coughed, blood speckling his lips. "You think this is over?" he rasped. "You're a dead man, old-timer. You and your little princess." John's expression didn't change. If anything, it hardened. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You tell your men to stay away from this farm. You tell them if they step foot here again, I won't stop at warning shots. Do you understand me?" Fury sneered. "You think you scare me?" John leaned in closer, his eyes boring into Fury's. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. "I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away with your life." For a moment, Fury's bravado faltered. The sheer intensity in John's gaze seemed to pierce through the biker's cocky facade. But then Fury smirked, the arrogance returning. "You're in over your head, Harper. You don't know what you're dealing with." John stood, flipping the knife in his hand before driving it into the ground just inches from Fury's face. "Neither do you." Without another word, John turned and walked back toward the house. Claire scrambled away from the door just as he stepped inside, her heart racing. Preparations for the final confrontation. The atmosphere in the house was tense. John paced the living room, his mind clearly racing as he formulated a plan. Claire sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched him. "Dad," she said finally, breaking the silence. "What happens now?" John stopped pacing and looked at her. For the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we prepare for the worst." Claire swallowed hard. "You think they'll come back tonight?" John nodded. "Fury's not the kind of man to let this go. He'll bring reinforcements, more men, better weapons. We've got to be ready." The gravity of his words settled over Claire like a heavy blanket. She had always thought of herself as strong, but this was a level of danger she had never imagined. Still, she wasn't about to back down. If her father was willing to fight for her, she would do the same for him. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. John studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the kitchen. "There's a toolbox under the sink. Grab the wire cutters and the duct tape." Claire did as she was told, her hands steady as she gathered the tools. When she returned, John explained his plan. "We're going to set up more traps," he said. "Tripwires, barricades, anything that can slow them down. And you're going to stay inside, no matter what." Claire opened her mouth to protest, but John held up a hand. "No arguments," he said. "If they break through, I need to know you're safe." Reluctantly, Claire nodded. Together, they spent the next few hours fortifying the farm. John set up tripwires along the main entry points, rigging them with cans and bells to act as alarms. Claire helped him move heavy furniture to block the doors and windows. Every movement felt surreal, like they were preparing for a battle in a war zone, rather than defending their quiet little farm. By the time they finished, the sun had set, and the farm was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the moon, casting long shadows across the yard. The attack. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. Claire was sitting in the living room, her rifle resting across her lap, when she heard it. The faint hum of engines in the distance. Her heart leaped into her throat as she scrambled to her feet. "Dad," she called, her voice trembling. John appeared almost instantly, his rifle in hand. He didn't say anything, just nodded toward the window. Claire followed his gaze and saw them, dozens of headlights cutting through the darkness as the iron wolves approached. "They're here," John said quietly. The bikers didn't stop at the driveway this time. Instead, they roared onto the property, their engines growling like beasts. John motioned for Claire to stay behind him as he stepped out onto the porch. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. "This is your last warning," he shouted. "Turn around and leave, or you'll regret it." Fury stepped forward, his men fanning out behind him. "You've got guts, Harper," he called. "But guts won't save you now." John didn't respond. Instead, he aimed his rifle at the lead bike and fired. The shot hit its mark, the tire exploding in a spray of rubber and metal. The bike skidded to a halt, its rider tumbling to the ground. The rest of the gang froze, momentarily stunned. "Now," John barked. Claire sprang into action, triggering the traps they had set earlier. The tripwires snapped, sending cans and bells clattering to the ground. The noise was deafening, disorienting the bikers as they tried to regroup. One of them stepped on a hidden nail board, letting out a howl of pain as he stumbled back. But the iron wolves weren't giving up. They surged forward, their numbers overwhelming. John fired shot after shot, each one precise and calculated. Claire watched in awe as he moved like a soldier, his every action deliberate. One of the bikers managed to break through the barricades, charging toward the house. Claire didn't think. She raised her rifle and fired. The shot hit the man's shoulder, and he fell to the ground with a cry of pain. "Good shot," John called over his shoulder. Claire didn't have time to feel proud. Another biker was already coming, his crowbar raised. She braced herself, but before he could reach her, John was there, tackling the man to the ground. The two men grappled, their movements brutal and desperate. The turning point. The fight raged on. The farm transformed into a battlefield. Claire lost track of time, her focus narrowing to the immediate danger in front of her. The iron wolves were relentless, but so were she and her father. Together, they held their ground, refusing to let the gang overtake them. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tide began to turn. The bikers were running out of steam, their attacks growing sloppy. One by one, they retreated, dragging their injured comrades with them. Fury was the last to go, his face twisted with fury as he mounted his bike. "This isn't over, Harper," he snarled. "You'll pay for this." John stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Fury's chest. "If I see you again," he said, his voice deadly calm, "you won't walk away." Fury hesitated, then revved his engine and roared away into the night. The aftermath. When the last of the bikers was gone, Claire collapsed onto the porch steps, her body shaking from exhaustion. John sat beside her, his rifle resting across his knees. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Is it over?" Claire finally asked. John sighed, his shoulders slumping. "For now." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with questions. "Dad, how did you do all that?" John met her gaze, his expression softening. "I did what I had to," he said simply. "For you." Tears pricked Claire's eyes as she leaned her head against his shoulder. She didn't have the words to express what she was feeling. Gratitude, pride, love. All she knew was that, no matter what happened next, they would face it together. The quiet of the night felt fragile, as though it could shatter at the slightest sound. Claire leaned against her father's shoulder, exhaustion tugging at her like an anchor, but her mind was far from restful. The farm, once a place of peace and solitude, now bore the scars of battle. Broken fences, shattered windows, and the faint metallic smell of gunpowder served as stark reminders of the chaos that had unfolded. "You think they'll be back?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer immediately. He stared into the distance, his jaw tight, his fingers absently gripping the rifle across his lap. Finally, he exhaled deeply. Men like Fury don't take defeat lightly. He'll be back, and he'll bring more men. Claire felt a wave of fear rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. "So what do we do now?" John turned to her, his expression softening despite the steel in his eyes. "We prepare, but not alone this time." Claire frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" John stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he stretched his sore muscles. "We're going to call for help." A call for reinforcements. The farmhouse didn't have much in the way of technology, just an old landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall. John dialed a number from memory, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Claire stood in the doorway, watching him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Who are you calling?" she asked. John raised a hand, signaling her to wait. The line clicked, and a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "This is Blake." "It's John Harper," her father said, his tone formal and direct. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end let out a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't heard that name in years. What's the occasion?" John didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help. It's urgent." The man on the line, Blake, grew serious. "What kind of trouble are you in?" "Bikers," John said. "A gang called the Iron Wolves. They've been harassing my daughter and threatening the farm. There's a lot of them, and they're not backing down." Blake's tone shifted, laced with concern and readiness. "You still got that old unit in you, Harper." "I'm about to find out," John replied. "But I could use some backup." There was another pause, and then Blake said, "I'll round up a few guys. We'll be there by morning." John hung up the phone and turned to Claire, who was watching him with wide eyes. "Who was that?" she asked. "An old friend," John said. "We served together. He knows how to handle situations like this." Claire's curiosity burned brighter. "How many old friends like that do you have?" John smirked faintly. "Enough." The final stand. By dawn, the reinforcements arrived. 3 men and 1 woman stepped out of 2 dusty trucks, their faces weathered but their eyes sharp. They were all dressed in practical clothing, their movements efficient and deliberate. Claire couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and intimidation as they greeted her father with firm handshakes and knowing smiles. "Harper," Blake said, clapping John on the shoulder. He was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and a scar running down his left cheek. "You always seem to find trouble, don't you?" "Wouldn't be calling you if it weren't serious," John replied. He gestured toward Claire. "This is my daughter, Claire." Blake tipped his hat to her. "You must be tough, growing up with this guy." Claire managed a small smile. "I'm learning." The group wasted no time getting to work. Under John's direction, they reinforced the barricades, added more traps to the property, and strategically positioned themselves around the farm. Claire was given a spot in the barn loft, where she had a clear view of the driveway with her rifle. As the sun climbed higher, the tension on the farm grew thicker. Everyone knew the Iron Wolves would come, they just didn't know when. The wolves strike again. The attack came just before noon. A low rumble announced the arrival of the Iron Wolves, their motorcycles tearing down the driveway in a show of force. This time, there were even more of them, at least 20 bikes, each one carrying a man armed and ready for a fight. Claire's heart pounded as she crouched in the loft, her rifle trained on the approaching gang. She spotted Fury at the front of the pack, his face twisted with anger. The bikers stopped just short of the barricades, dismounting their bikes and spreading out. "Harper," Fury shouted, his voice echoing across the fields. "You think a few traps and some old war buddies are gonna stop us? You're dead meat." John stepped out onto the porch, calm and composed. "You've already lost, Fury," he called back. "Turn around while you still can." Fury laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't scare me, old man." Blake stepped up beside John, his shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. "Maybe you should be," he said, his voice low and menacing. Fury's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The battle. The bikers surged forward, but they were met with fierce resistance. The traps John and his team had set proved devastating. Tires blew out, men tripped over tripwires, and scattered nails punctured boots. Blake and the others opened fire, their shots precise and controlled. Claire watched from her vantage point, her heart racing as chaos erupted below. When a group of bikers tried to flank the barn, she took a deep breath and aimed her rifle. She fired, hitting one in the leg and sending the others scrambling for cover. John was in the thick of it, moving with the agility and precision of a man half his age. He used the terrain to his advantage, ducking behind cover and taking out bikers one by one. Blake and the others backed him up, their teamwork seamless. Fury, however, was relentless. He fought his way through the traps and the gunfire, determined to reach the farmhouse. When he finally made it to the porch, he kicked down the barricade and stormed inside. The final confrontation. Claire scrambled down from the loft, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands. She reached the farmhouse just in time to see Fury and her father facing off in the living room. Fury swung a crowbar, but John dodged, countering with a punch that sent the biker staggering. "Give it up, Fury," John said, his voice cold. "You're out of your league." Fury snarled, lunging at John again. This time, John caught his arm and twisted, forcing Fury to drop the crowbar. With a swift motion, John swept Fury's legs out from under him, pinning him to the ground. "It's over," John said, pressing the barrel of his rifle against Fury's chest. For a moment, it seemed like Fury might try to fight back. But then he looked into John's eyes and saw something that made him freeze. Slowly, he raised his hands in surrender. Aftermath. By the time the dust settled, the iron wolves were gone. Those who could still walk had dragged their injured comrades back to their bikes and fled. Fury was the last to leave, his face bruised and bloodied as he glared at John. "This isn't over," Fury growled. "Yes, it is," John replied. "If I see you or your men again, I won't hold back." Fury didn't respond. He limped to his bike, started the engine, and rode off without looking back. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the distance, Claire finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned to her father, who was already helping Blake and the others clean up. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. John shook his head. "Not after this. Fury knows he's beaten." Claire nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in days, she felt safe. And as she looked at her father, standing tall and resolute, she realized just how much he had done to protect her. "You're amazing, Dad," she said softly. John smiled, pulling her into a hug. "I just did what any father would do." But Claire knew better. Her father wasn't just any man. He was a protector, a warrior, and her hero. And no matter what challenges came their way, she knew they would face them together.